we're gonna go through the install of our mid-roof transit bed install kit. So this is for the mid-roof long, so the 148-inch wheelbase and the long body. This install video we're actually filming on a 130 wheelbase. We don't have an install kit for that. The bed rails won't work for it, unfortunately, but the install process will be the same, and it'll give you a good visual of the roof height and where that all kind of plays in terms of the mid-roof versus the high roof version. So everything's going to be really similar to our high roof version if you've done that before, just a slightly shorter piece of A-frame and track. But we're going to go through and do our 4 verticals, which you should have gotten in your kit. You'll have 4 vertical pieces of steel, and then 4 vertical pieces of track that correspond to those pieces, and then you'll have a hardware kit as well. The bed kits don't include the drill bits or the tools or anything like that, so you will need a 3/16 drill bit, a 25/64 drill bit, a step bit, and then a drill, an impact driver, and then a 4mm hex. We have an electric screwdriver here, but you can just use a hand tool if you'd like. You definitely don't want to use your drill or impact driver for the track bolts because you can seize the rib nuts, which you definitely want to avoid. The last thing you're going to need is a rust prevention and a deburring tool. So you want to make sure that we're treating all of the holes that we drill to make sure that you don't have any rust down the line. I'm going to use some tape to hold my pieces in place. Your hardware is also going to have some set screws, which you can also use, or clamps, whatever you're most comfortable with. I like to get everything in place with some tape or clamps first before using the set screws if you're working by yourself. If you have a buddy that can hold things in place, that makes it easier and you can totally just pop the screws in there where it is. But I find that if I'm trying to hold it and put a set screw in, the piece can shift on me a little bit. So having everything nice and secure with some tape or clamps makes it a little bit easier. So we're going to start with TH1, which is on your driver's side. So this is at your 0 line of the van. It's got a couple places where it's going to index in. Yeah, the first is going to be this hole here, this factory hole. So kind of right at the crest of the window bay here. And then it's going to line up with a hole that's pre-drilled in your A-frame. So right under the TH1 label, you'll have a larger circle. So we're going to line that up there. And then we'll see as the rest of it kind of fits in. It's going to kind of find its home on the inside of this bay. So that'll give you a little bit of a guide. So I line this top piece up here, and then as we move down, you have an index here as well. That's going to line up with another factory hole. And then we have one at the very bottom, which we'll show a little bit closer up in a second. I'm going to go ahead and tape my top piece first, just to keep it in place. Our last index hole is all the way at the bottom here. So you can see here, because it's a 130, we have the wheel well. The 148 won't have that, it'll be farther back. So you'll have this a little bit more open, but you'll still have a factory hole right here. So right kind of up into the right from your bottom PEM nut, you'll have a factory hole, and you just want to make sure that's lining up. And those 3 points will give you your vertical alignment as well as your alignment horizontally. So once you have those lined up, you can, again, use some tape or clamps and then use the set screws in your hardware kit to get it set in place. And then we're going to move on to the next step of marking out our PEM nut holes and then drilling out our rib nut holes. Okay, so now that we have our piece up in place, we added a set screw in this corner here and then down at the bottom as well. And our indexing holes still look like they're lining up really well with those factory holes. Again, if you have a partner to work with, this makes it a lot easier, especially for this next step. So what we're going to do now is drill out all of our rib nut holes. So that's going to be these larger holes. We'll start with this TH1 piece here. This will again be our index, but that'll make sure that we're keeping everything nice and aligned. So we're going to drill out this hole first, or our indexes first in general. So this top one here, this kind of little bump out in the middle, and then our one at the very bottom, just to make sure that we didn't drift at all with our set screws, and to make sure that when we're drilling out everything else that we're not drifting at all either. So we're going to do that. The other thing that I like to do at this point to make sure that I don't forget is we're going to mark all of our PEM nut holes. So that's going to be the pre-threaded pieces in the A-frame. We want to make sure that we take this piece off and then drill out behind all of those so that we have enough clearance for our bolts. So you can use a punch or a pen or whatever you have on hand. I typically use just the end of a rivet. So I just stick it right through the PEM nut hole, make a little mark, make sure that I mar up the paint a little bit. You can see through there to make sure that you've got a mark there, and then you'll know where to drill out. We'll just use a step bit for this. We'll show that in a minute. And that just makes sure, again, that we have clearance for the bolts, that once you have this piece kind of permanently in place, you don't run into any clearance issues when you go to mount your track. So I'm going to do that all the way up the piece. So anywhere there's a PEM nut, I'll stick it through just to make sure there's no metal behind it that's going to cause any problems. Once we've done that and drilled out our 3 indexing points, we're going to actually remove this piece, treat those holes, get rid of any metal shavings, and then put the piece back in place, and we'll start mounting, starting with our indexing points. So we're going to start drilling. I've marked all my PEM nut holes, and then I'm going to drill out our indexes real quick, and then we'll remove our piece, get rid of any shavings, treat the holes, all that good stuff. Now that we have our holes pre-drilled for our indexing points, the next step is I'm going to actually drill out all of those PEM nut holes that I marked, and then we can deburr all of the holes all at once and clear away any shavings. If you don't have a step bit, you can just use a series of drill bits and just work your way up. You do want a pretty big hole just to make sure that you don't get the piece mounted and run into issues. It's better to oversize it a little bit than undersize it. So I usually do start with a smaller step bit, or smaller drill bit, sorry, just to make sure that my step bit doesn't drift at all. It's got a little bit less of a point on there, and it just gives it a good starting point. You'll notice that I'm wearing eye protection. Make sure to have all of your PPE. Eye protection, gloves if you want them. You will have some metal shavings like dusting up throughout this process, so they're never a bad idea. And when you're drilling into metal, the shavings are really hot, so be careful. We'll make sure again that we don't have any clearance issues. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and deburr those few holes that I did and then rust prevent, and then we'll do another layer of rust prevent once we have our A-frame piece on, because we drilled through that as well, so we scraped away a little of the paint. If you have an air tool, you can use that as well, just to blow away any shavings. So I just use a rag usually, just to wipe away any of the metal shavings that I created, and so that they don't get caught up between the A-frame and the sheet metal of the van. So at this point, you can either use a riv nut to hold this in place at our TH1 piece, or you can put your set screws back in. And then we're going to go ahead and actually, once we've confirmed that all of our PEM nuts are free and clear behind using a bolt, we're going to go ahead and set this first indexing point here, and that'll kind of start the process to permanently installing this piece. So I'm going to grab my riv nuts. And you're going to need your riv nut setter at this point as well. We have a pneumatic tool here. But you might have a hand tool since you only have a handful of rib nuts in your bed install kit. If you're using an air tool, you want to make sure to test a few rib nuts before you actually use it in your piece to make sure that it's to the right settings and crushing to the right thickness. Your A-frame is going to be about 1/8 of an inch, and the sheet metal can be anywhere from like a 1/16 to 1/8, depending on where you are in the van. A lot of the home tools, like the Astro tool, will kind of auto adjust with the pressure to crush, but it's still a good idea to crush a few to make sure that you've got the right settings. To do that, you just thread it on, all the way onto the mandrel, and then you kind of do it halfway, and then all the way, and it should spin right off. Ooh. And you'll see that there's a distance between the kind of mushroomed piece on the riv nut and then the top piece, so that's kind of going to be the area where you are going to compress the metal together. If it's too big, your riv nut will just spin and you won't be able to get a bolt in there. It'll just continue to spin, not thread. And if it's too tight, it can kind of pull through the metal and mushroom out your actual A-frame, which will prevent you from setting a rib nut at all. So you definitely want to be kind of right in that same ballpark. You can hold it up to your actual A-frame and see if it feels tight as a test. So now that my rust prevent has dried, I'm going to go ahead and start with this first rib nut here. So I'm going to take my rib nut, thread it onto my tool. And you want to make sure that your tool is nice and straight and that your A-frame piece is pressed up against the sheet metal of the van. You don't want a gap between the A-frame and the sheet metal. And then we're going to go ahead and set. And then we've got our first attachment. You can see it's in there nice and good. It's not loose at all. And if you're worried about the threads, you can thread a bolt in there and make sure that everything's good. And if it's not, again, you can drill it out and try again. So once we have that one set, we're going to move down onto our other indexing points. So we're going to start with this middle one, and then we'll do our bottom one as well. Okay, so now that all of our indexes are set, we're going to move on to our other rib nut holes. So you're going to have some larger holes in your A-frame. The ones on these kind of side tabs here would be if you got our full interior kit, so they won't be relevant for your bed install, but it's still good to set those to make sure that your A-frame's nice and secure. So we're going to set, I kind of start from the middle and work my way up and down with drilling my holes. Again, you want to make sure that the A-frame is nice and flush to the sheet metal of the van as you're drilling your holes, because we're going to drill them all out, kind of blow out any metal shavings, and then set our rib nuts. And if it's not pressed tight to the sheet metal, you can have misalignment on your holes from one to the next, which will cause some issues when you go to set your rib nuts. So I'm going to go ahead and drill all those out, clear any shavings from behind with a little bit of an air tool, or you can just kind of pop the metal out from the sheet metal and tap away any shavings. Deburr, rust prevent, and then set all those rib nuts using the same process that I did for the indexing points. Now we've got all of our rib nuts set. I like to go through with a bolt. And you can do this at the end too if you want, after all of your pieces are set. But you can just thread it in and make sure that your threads are nice and straight, that they're set well, and you don't have to redo anything. Same thing with the PEM nut holes that we did clearance for. You can thread those right into there as well. Just kind of know ahead of time if you're going to have to do any rework or not. After all of those are good and set, we're going to move on to our rivets. So in the bed frame in general, you're only going to have 3/16 rivets. So in this piece on the face, they're pretty minimal. You can basically put them in the two spots where we had set screws. There's one at the very bottom here, and then one in the top here. We can remove that set screw now. The other places we're going to have is right on the inner edge of this piece. It kind of sits flush against the window bay here. So we're going to have 3 along this inside edge. So we're going to go ahead and drill those out with a 3/16 drill bit and then set our 3/16 rivets in all of those holes. And you want to rust prevent those too before you set them. Once you've got your 3/16 rivets all set, we can move on to TH2, which is at the D pillar of the van. So the next piece we're going to set is TH2. So this one only has one index. It's going to be the first hole above your TH2 label in your A-frame piece. The piece is going to kind of find its home along the D pillar here, but we're actually going to find our side-to-side alignment with measurements, but setting this initial index first is going to give us a place to start, and then we'll have the bottom edge kind of free to move back and forth by a little bit if we need to. So it's really helpful here because we don't have a lot of set screw holes or a good clamping location to have a second set of hands to hold it in place while you drill that out and set your first rib nut. So before we drill out our first indexing point, we're going to go ahead and mark our rib nuts with a rivet just like we did in the first piece. This is going to allow us just to know where we need to drill out those access points behind. So this piece, again, is really helpful to have a second set of hands. So I'm going to have somebody hold this in place for me, and then I'm going to mark through all of those PEM nut holes. Okay, we've drilled out behind all of our PEM nuts, and we're just going to go ahead and deburr and then rust prevent just like we did with TH1. Okay, once we have all of those drilled, you're going to want your second set of hands again for this next part. We're going to go ahead and set our index and then move on to drilling all of our rib nut holes. Okay. Now that first index is going to hold everything nice and in place, and see we have a little bit of play back and forth on the bottom edge. So in the 148-inch wheelbase, you want to have 65 inches from center PEM nut to center PEM nut. So again, this is a really good place to have a second set of hands, but I would go ahead and get your measurement, You can get a clamp in at the bottom here. So you can get your measurement, get your piece clamped into place nice and tight, and then drill out your rib nut here. And then that way you can drill out these bottom two at once, clear any shavings, and then set the top couple as well to make sure everything's nice and secure. Okay, so I've gone ahead and added a clamp here down at the bottom. It's not super tight yet, but it's kind of in place so I'm not fumbling with things as I get my measurement. So if you see on this side, you can either go like side of this pem nut or the center. Ideally you want the center, so again if you have a second set of hands that can hold this side. And then we pull forward to the other piece. So now I put it right in the center. And then you want the pem nut of your back piece right at 65. And then once you've got that in place, you can go ahead and tighten your clamp and set everything and start to set your bottom rib nut, which will give you your side-to-side placement. So once you have your measurement and you're consistent all the way up and down, again, I'm going to set this one first just to make sure that my alignment's locked in, and then I'll move to these bottom two. I can drill them both out at the same time and then drill my top two out at the same time, clear any shavings, do my rust prevent, and then set my rib nuts. It's a good thing here too before you start to check that all of your pem nuts are clear behind, just because if you have to drill out the piece, now's the time to do it. After I have this piece set, I like to go back and check my measurement one more time just to make sure that nothing drifted or I'm not having any issues. Here, partner. Here, come down to this guy. My measurement looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and drill out these bottom two holes and then my top two, and again, go through that same process and get my rib nut set. And then we can go through and set our rivets. So we're going to have one at the side here. You could also use this throughout this process as a set screw hole. And then we're going to have them on the inner side of the window bay as well, similar to the front edge, but we'll have 6. Again, I would do these one at a time just because they are a little bit tough to get flush with the van body, so it's easy when you're drilling to not be spot on. So I would go one at a time. I like to do one in this one in this guy, and then one in the bottom, and then work my way back up. So we're going to go ahead and just run through that and not talk through it on this one, since it's a very similar process to TH1. Your passenger side is going to be almost an exact mirror of your driver's side, so we're not going to go through each and every step, but you're going to have the same indexes on your TH3 piece. You'll have one right underneath the TH3 label, your little bump out piece here, and then your one at the very bottom. So we're going to line that up with a factory hole here you can see at the top. And again, you can use clamps or another set of hands or your set screws to hold all this in place. So we're going to get that index set, and then you'll see we have one at the mid of the van here, and then one at the very bottom. So we're going to get this in place with our set screws, mark all of our PEM nuts again, and drill out behind. Just a reminder, there's probably one at the bottom, one kind of partway up the bottom here, and then a third one. So they're all going to be in this kind of lower third of the piece. But I would double check all of your PEM nuts to make sure you have clearance, because again, it's really hard to drill them out once you've got them in place. And you have to remove the piece in order to do that. So we're going to start there. Once we have all of our PEM nuts cleared, We'll set our indexes, and then we'll move on to all of our other rib nuts and rivets and get the piece completely set just like we did with TH1. And then we'll do the same with TH4. So this is going to be, again, a mirror image of TH2. You'll have that one index at the top, and then the side to side will be determined by your 65-inch measurement between your PEM nuts. Now that we've got our A-frame in, we're going to install our track. So we're just going to show one piece, and then you'll repeat the same process on the rest of the A-frame. So some of our bolts are going to be going into the rib nuts that we set, and some will be going into the PEM nuts that are preset in your A-frame pieces. The biggest thing here is that you want to make sure, if you have another set of hands, again, that's helpful, but you want to make sure that you're pressing the piece of track flush against the piece as you screw everything in. You don't want one bolt holding it against the A-frame and all of that tension coming onto one bolt if you can help it. It'll just, occasionally it can mess up threads or seize the bolt or something like that. So I just keep one hand on my track piece and then screw everything in with the other. And I try to get all the bolts in a few turns and then do everything a little bit at a time. And you want to make sure to use Loctite on all of your bolts. I've got just a little tube of Loctite here. This isn't included in your kit or in your bed kit, so you do have to go get it. We use a Loctite 248, which is a pretty like low level Loctite. It can be broken with a hand tool, but it does keep the bolt from rattling out. It's important to note here too that do not use a impact driver or power tool for this step. You don't want to, again, strip or seize your bolts. We use an electric screwdriver, but it has a really low torque on it. A 4mm hex is all that you need. A hand key works great. Yeah, you just definitely don't want to use any sort of like massive force because you don't want to spin a rib nut or seize a bolt because it's a really involved process to get that out if that happens. So I'm going to go ahead and add these in. Okay, so we've got all of our track mounted. So this is the last part of the bed install. So from here you can go ahead and mount your bed rail and your bed panels. Your bed rails are going to lock into the vertical track. You just want to make sure it's at the same height on your forward and aft rail and then side to side as well so that your bed is level. We're not going to show that in this van because again it's a 130, so not technically the van that this was made for. So the bed rail wouldn't quite fit, but we have another video on our Instagram if you want to see kind of the process of mounting that. And you can feel free to give us a call if you have any questions.